Velkommen til Samfundstanker. Det er tirsdag den 16. august, og det her er et lidt særligt afsnit, fordi jeg har besøg af en amerikaner, så vi vil tale engelsk. Jeg slår over engelsk nu. Today's guest is Professor Art Carden. Art is Professor of Economics at Samford University's Brock School of Business. He's also affiliated with a number of research institutions, including as a senior fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and the Fraser Institute. Art Carden is co-editor of the Southern Economic Journal and has published papers in journals such as Southern Economic Journal, Journal of Urban Economics, Public Choice, and Contemporary Economic Policy. He's co-author of this book, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, which he co-authored with Professor Deirdre McCloskey. It's published by the University of Chicago Press. Now, Deirdre McCloskey is a former guest of CPOS, where she spoke, and that speech was actually published in this podcast, so we will link to that and to the conversation that we've had in a different podcast with Professor Deirdre McCloskey. So there are certain aspects of the book that we've already covered there that maybe we don't go so much into, but it is a great book. It's very condensed, obviously, because it's your attempt to, with Professor McCloskey, to condense 1,700 pages plus notes, and there are many notes as well in the original trilogy. Tell me just briefly about the original trilogy and how you got to writing this book and what it's about.
So Deirdre's original Bourgeois trilogy, it consists of 3 books, one published in 2006, The Bourgeois Virtues, another in 2010, Bourgeois Dignity, and then in 2016, Bourgeois Equality. And these are massive, massive tomes. Like you mentioned, about 1,700 pages in total. We met, in October of 2012. We were both filming some stuff for the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and we'd gone back a while, and she asked me if I wanted to co-author this book with her to try to produce a shorter, more accessible version of her overall Bourgeois trilogy, and the answer is always yes when a scholar of Professor McCloskey's magnitude asks you to do anything. So we ended up working together on this. It was published in 2020, and the paperback actually is going to be out in November. And of course, the title, so the title is "Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich: How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World," and it was an adventure to write.
Now, bourgeois is normally a word that is that has some negative connotations,
right.
Except in Danish. There's a Danish word, borgerlig, which is at least for people who are classical liberals or conservatives or neutral, a positive word. Yeah. It's so that's kind of interesting, and it's a word that combines the whole non-socialist movement in Denmark. So if you're conservative, you'd call yourself borgerlig. Bourgeois would be an okay translation, I guess. If you're a classical liberal, you would as well. And even people on the far right would tend to call themselves bourgeois or borgerlig. But why do you? But the term in English, I think, is slightly unusual.
So this is
to use in a positive connotation,
right? And part of this I know from when Deirdre really sort of formulated the project originally. This would have been, over about 20 years ago now. She wanted to use the word bourgeois very specifically to kind of needle the left a little bit, and a lot of our friends in academia who see it as almost a term of derision. She argues that to a lot of the things that we associate with being bourgeois and base and sort of not high and fancy, she argues are in fact actually virtuous. So most people in the United States, when they hear bourgeois, first of all, they ask, okay, what is bourgeois? Then the people who know, they think of middle class values. They think of really not having much of a purpose beyond the next paycheck and a variety of different things. One of the things that Deirdre argues in her Big Bourgeois trilogy, and that we try to make clear here, is that a lot of what we would think of as bourgeois virtues are in fact actually virtuous. There's a certain, I'll call it a moral sophistication that comes with a bourgeois emphasis on taking care of your family, taking care of your community, doing your job, showing up to stuff on time, things like that, that may not express the sort of greatness of soul that so many academics like me want to hold in very high esteem, but that nonetheless enable us to take care of each other and that have helped to generate the world in which we're so much richer than our ancestors, and in particular, in which we, who are probably not the descendants of royalty, I know I'm not, can have these sorts of discussions about whether or not being bourgeois is okay. And that's kind of the essence of her big project, and then what we're trying to distill into something a little bit more accessible here.
What you're saying makes me think about an experience I had quite some years ago now, where I turned up at some panel debate on a Saturday, and the moderator said, it says something about the society we live in, that on a day like today, the shopping mall is full, but the city council building is empty. And I said, no, that's great.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the way you want things to be. And what's so bad about a shopping mall? I mean, what would the world be like if we had none? Actually, you've done a lot of research into that Walmart and shopping malls and retail regulation.
Right.
And maybe we can get into that later. But you want to expand on that idea? Why is it that bourgeois values like actually turning up on time or pay? What's wrong with paying your paycheck? For Christ's sake, getting your paycheck and paying your bills and the rent on time. That's good things, right? Yeah.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the shopping mall thing, because I remember taking a class when I was an undergraduate, the professor lamenting the fact that in the 50s and 60s, like all the old men of the community would sit in front of the courthouse. And now they sit at Waffle House or a fast food restaurant drinking coffee, or he said they sit in the food court at the mall. And he thought this was a horrible thing. And I remember thinking, first of all, we live in Alabama, which is it's funny that right now in Copenhagen, for example, people are talking about how hot it is, and this is nothing like the weather in Alabama. And I can't imagine anything more miserable than sitting outside a courthouse in August in Alabama. Absolutely, let's sit in the air-conditioned mall food court. And while it's true that someone shopping at a mall or working at a mall is probably not thinking about big questions about how we organize society, they're nonetheless engaged in this cooperative endeavor that allows us to care for one another without necessarily caring that much about one another. So I travel a lot, and very, very frequently will forget something. And on this trip in particular, I arrived on time and my luggage didn't. So,
I'm sorry to hear that.
These things happen. So I get here and I get checked into my hotel, and I've been wearing the same clothes for 30 hours or whatever. And I
can't tell.
Well, not now, not now. This is by the time I get this is in the luggage I picked up at the airport last night. So I thought, okay,
it did turn up, right?
Right. Oh, no. So I probably look and smell like death, no doubt. So I go to the mall and meet a young man, and he's never seen me before in his life. He probably doesn't really care that much about who I am or anything. He doesn't know my kids, doesn't know their favorite food or anything like that. And yet he's there and willing to help me take care of the things that I find important. He's willing to help me find a clean shirt and clean undershirts and clean socks and stuff that's very, 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 very valuable when you just really feel awful. And I don't know him. I'll probably never see him again. I don't know what he does for fun. But we're able to work together to advance one another's goals by coming together in this commercial exchange. Now, some people might say that, well, I should know who he is. I should care a lot about him in some very, very real and deep sense. But unfortunately, people have cognitive and moral limitations. I have my own children, a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 10-year-old, that they are more than enough. They're more than enough to handle and more than enough to think about and deal with. And one of the cool things about a commercial society is it allows strangers to come together for mutual benefit. And I don't think people appreciate that the way that they should.
No, I agree. And you said that people working at the mall probably don't think about great things.
Right.
But that's that's a pity. I think, I think that's really a pity. And I think all of us, both those of us who are customers, who get this sort of miracle happening,
right?
That you can turn up there as an American and get what you want and what you're looking for in that situation at a reasonable price. We should be grateful. And the people working there should be proud.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And when I'm at a food, supermarket, food shop or whatever, and I look at mangoes or avocados or whatever, and say it's a miracle.
Yeah.
If somebody was to, the part of the market system is that we get prices, and if we didn't have a market and somebody came with a let's say a mango, I said, okay, here's the deal. This thing will grow I don't even know where mangoes grow, right? This will grow somewhere.
Not Denmark.
Right. It'll be cultivated somewhere, and at some point it'll be nurtured. At some point it'll be picked and carefully transported, and then somehow it gets to Denmark. I don't have a clue how it gets to Denmark. And then it's brought to the shop, and they make sure that it's there and available for me. And there's always mangoes virtually.
Yeah.
And some of them aren't sold, so they get old and they rot, etc. That's part of if you want it always to be available. That there will be some that are wasted. How much do you think one would cost? If I was asked, if they said $50, I was like, yeah, sounds reasonable.
Yeah. Oh, at least. Yeah. It's
so amazing that they can sell at a fraction of that.
Right. So mangoes, for example, they don't grow in Alabama. They don't grow in Denmark. Avocados, they don't grow in Alabama. They don't grow in Denmark. And yet we were able to get things like this at relatively low prices. In fact, so last night I walked around to a couple of the grocery stores near my hotel and saw these gigantic, beautiful looking mangoes, and thought this is a miracle that I'm in Northern Europe, and I can get the mangoes that are indigenous to equatorial regions where it's a lot hotter, and for a very, 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 very small price, and they're delicious. I didn't buy one. I probably should have. Right? Yeah, I know. Yeah, like I'm talking about this now, thinking
just in awe of the miracle.
We get at home. We shop at our local farmers market and buy things that are in season and whatnot. And sure, like the strawberries when they're in season in Alabama are better than the strawberries when they're not in season.
Of course,
but still, the notion that you can get pretty good strawberries at any time of year is incredible. And we think about what this means for nutrition. We think about what this means for quality of life. We think about what it means for the fact that we don't have to spend as much time feeding, clothing, and sheltering ourselves so that we don't die. That means that we have more time to spend on building relationships with friends and family and reading and nurturing ourselves. One of the more famous TED Talks is Hans Rosling, the Swedish epidemiologist, talking about the wonder of a washing machine. And he talks about when his family got their first washing machine and how it freed up all of this time they could spend reading books. And things like that. And I think about the time I've been able to spend reading to my kids because I haven't had to spend that time scratching the ground to grow wheat or corn or blueberries or what have you. And it's
that really resonates with me. I think I apologize to listeners. I think I've said this on a previous podcast, but my grandmother told me about washing, in the basement, and washing linen and all the stuff that you need to wash before the washing machines, and you need to heat the water, and it was cold basement. It was it was damp, and she told me, I am convinced that my rheumatism comes from that. And that was very, very. I mean, she had decades of her life that were painful because of that. So, and that's the sort of thing that go underappreciated these days. How is this? All this we're talking about, mangoes and washing machines. How is that related to bourgeois values?
So a lot of it it stems from what we call the Bourgeois Deal. So leave me alone and I'll make you rich. And around the middle of the 18th century or so, we started embracing liberty and dignity for entrepreneurs and innovators. And we came to think that there was more, that inventing a new thing might be something good to do, or running a business might be virtuous. It might be something to be esteemed. So, for example, a lot of people, when they go to college, they want to study business, or they want to do something that will get them a good job. And we think of that as just a normal and good, decent thing to do, to pay your bills on time, for example, to create value for other people. We stopped honoring and esteeming and idolizing kings and priests who were sort of spending all of their time slaughtering other people or what have you, and instead started to venerate James Watt for inventing the steam engine, or people who innovated in the production of textiles. Or today, like for example, Steve Jobs is somebody that people look up to as sort of a great person of the modern era. For we think about the iPod, the iPad, the iPhone.
But it's not a digital situation, though. It doesn't go from 0 to 1.
Right.
It goes from, I don't know, something close to 0 to 0.85 or something like that.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot of mistrust against bankers, for instance.
Yes.
I mean, that's been ongoing for centuries. And when there's a financial crisis, it just gets a lot worse, and there's very little appreciation of how important the financial system is, and how much benefit that has given to us. I mean, the washing machine is easy to see and understand, but the financial system, people just think of banks and bankers as horrible creatures that live off the back of the rest of us. So, and it's some entrepreneurs are well liked, but big business owners not necessarily.
Right.
If they're no longer on, it's most the sort of self-made man that made it from nowhere to wherever he is, but. There's also a lot of stuff going on where people aren't that happy about it.
Right?
Could you say some more about that?
There's a weird tension. So the word that we hear in the United States all the time is disruptor. So everybody wants to be a disruptor of this industry or that industry, the other industry, and we hold up like the technology entrepreneurs and innovators and things like that. While at the same time, bankers we tend not to trust, because people, first of all, don't understand really what prices do. They don't understand what profits are, and they don't understand what interest means. So a lot of people think of bankers and financial intermediaries as just these parasites who are not actually creating any value, but they're just sort of extracting resources from the economy. That though raises an interesting implication, which is, and I think about the last time I got a mortgage, when I borrow money to buy a house. If the bankers are just there effectively taxing us, or effectively just sort of taking a cut, then it seems like we could save a lot of money by doing this differently, by going around, just walk around the neighborhood or whatever, and borrowing money, $5, $10, $15 at a time, until I come up with enough money to buy my house. But then when you think about that, you realize that that's utterly absurd. Right. And it's something I try to tell my students time and time again, because a lot of our students at Samford end up going into banking. What they're doing is they're reducing transaction costs. So the cost of organizing exchanges, they're making it a lot easier to link people with money to save to people who wish to borrow. So instead of having to go all over Birmingham, with hat in hand asking people for money, I'm able to just go to the bank, and they're able to specialize in figuring out, okay, how risky am I? How likely am I to pay back the loan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Furthermore, when I've got money to save, I don't have to wait for people to come around asking to borrow $10, $15, et cetera, and then having to evaluate, okay, is this person really going to pay me back? I can put it in the bank, and they handle all of that hard work for me. So that's an area where we appreciate it a little bit more than we used to. Again, for the better part of history, bankers and intermediaries and quote unquote middlemen have been seen as being almost like in league with the devil. That's changed a little bit.
Interest charging was illegal.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So charging interest, for example, in a lot of religious traditions, has been either outright prohibited or looked at as being something untoward. So people say, well, you can't make money off of money. Fortunately, in the last 100 years or so, we've come to understand that, in fact, actually time is valuable, and moving resources from some point in the future to some point in the present is itself creating value. but we still have a long way to go. I think in terms of really understanding and understanding how the financial sector works and
I think
what it does.
I think you're right that with the financial sector, we do understand it better actually than we did. I think you're right there. What about big business? What movement do you see there in general? Yeah,
so again, that's fascinating because everybody wants to be a disruptor. If you're going to disrupt, then presumably you're going to create something big. For reasons I'm not sure I fully understand, because I'm not a psychologist, we tend to look very skeptically upon large enterprises. It's easy when you think about a shop where you know the proprietor or it's been in a family for generations, like you can see the guy behind the counter who's taking care of everything. Shareholders and executives in some far off place, they tend not to be they're not as morally relevant or not as morally salient as somebody that you can see, a living, breathing human being you can look at. And so large enterprises tend to be much more depersonalized. And by virtue of the fact that we can't sympathize with a large enterprise like a Walmart, for example, the same way that we can sympathize with a smaller enterprise like a local shop, is one of the things I think that helps to explain why people are very skeptical generally of really, really, really big business. But what big business does, well, several things. First and probably most importantly, they expand selection and they lower prices. So we get more stuff at lower prices.
If there's competition.
If there's competition, right. Yeah, and that's a very, very big if. Of course, people would say there's a lot more to life than low prices and wide selection, and that's absolutely true. But low prices and wide selection expand our possibilities with respect to the people that we love the most and care the most about. So again, I think about my family. By virtue of having low prices and wide selection because of the effect of large retail establishments like Walmart or Target in the United States, we're able to have we have fewer things to worry about because our money goes farther, and we have a much broader scope for building relationships. So think about my 10-year-old, for example, has become a Lego fanatic recently, and he was enthralled by the fact that I was coming to the country where Lego is from, and this seems trivial in some sense to make these little plastic bricks and to lower the prices of these little plastic bricks. But when I'm building Lego sets with my son, like that's really building a relationship. That's a very important human thing, and some executive at Lego somewhere.
I built with Legos when I was a child, and that was no laughing matter to me. No. That was very, very important. And I probably learned a lot, of all kinds of from you know using my hands with fine, what do you call that?
Fine motor skills.
Fine motor skills. To you know, planning, creating something, to being creative, whatever. You know, that I probably learned a lot. Playing with Legos and having fun.
Right.
So that's, I agree, that's an example. There's no laughing matter. Of course, there are, I guess, part of the problem with all this and assessing an individual business is that you do have businesses that are parasitical.
Right. Yeah.
So you mentioned Steve Jobs. I could mention Carlos Slim in Mexico. Right. How did he get rich?
Yes.
Well, you know, he got his buddies in government to hand him a telephone monopoly, and he charged higher prices than market prices to the poor Mexicans because they needed to make phone calls, and that's how he became very wealthy. And that's obviously the opposite of bourgeois values. It is, yeah, and that's one of the reasons why. So, for example, my favorite novel is Atlas Shrugged. By Ayn Rand, and it's sort of an homage to the capitalist bourgeois spirit. And one of my favorite passages, one of my favorite phrases in the book describes one character. It says he never wanted to make money, he only wanted to get it. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, because in a commercial society, making money means creating value. And making other people happy. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Making other people better off. You know, when Lego earns a profit, it's because they have made people like me and you better off. And their son. Again, you know, right? Yeah, they don't know us. They may not. I'm sure they care about us in some abstract sense. Like they're probably not
they probably don't wish us ill, but they don't care about us the same way they care about their own kids. But the Carlos Slim example, that's merely getting money. That's getting money by prohibiting competition, by restricting competition, by using force to be the only game in town.
But I guess you could argue now, if I'm, if I'm going to be the devil's advocate here,
sure.
Adam Smith wrote that if you set business people together, they will conspire against the public.
Yeah.
So why isn't that bourgeois values?
Okay.
I mean, they. It's an easier way to get money than to make money.
So when we lay out what we call the Bourgeois Deal, so it basically says, imagine the world in 3 acts. So it's a 3-act drama. In the first act, someone says, so Steve Jobs says, okay, tell you what, let me try new things. Let me come up with a new way to store music, 1,000 songs in your pocket or whatever. In Act 1, let me try a thing and let me keep the profits. Okay, I recognize that in Act 2, the second act, that's going to attract competition. Microsoft is going to come up with something called the Zune which ended up failing, but that's going to try to compete with the iPod, or the iPhone is going to be fantastic, but then Samsung and everybody else is going to try to make their own thing. I recognize there's going to be some competition, but by Act 3, I will have made a lot of money and everybody else will be much better off. The problem with this bourgeois deal is that it's kind of unstable there in Act 2, because the first thing that everybody wants to do when they succeed is pull up the ladder and prevent other people from coming in and competing with them. So this is where political institutions are really important, and also where sort of a broad ethical consensus really matters, because everybody loves the profits that come from their own innovation, and they want to protect those by, again, preventing other people from competing with them. So where we have to be very, very clear politically is in making sure that the rules are such that it's really hard for Apple to prevent other people from competing with them, or really hard for Netto and Aldi to prevent other people from competing with them, or just really, really hard for people to erect these barriers to entry. Which again, this is the substance of basically the way the world has worked for almost all of history. In Europe during the medieval period, the guilds were famously restrictive in terms of what they would allow people to do. I forget the exact country and context, but I remember one place it said, "No one shall innovate in the baking of bread." So like there's the way you're supposed to bake bread, and nobody's supposed to do anything different. Or if you want to, again, in a different place, if you have a new method for weaving, then it has to be approved by all of the senior weavers in the guild, or you can't do it.
Right. Okay.
And this is like Carlos Slim, except in the 15 and 1600s.
Yeah. Yeah. And you had royal privilege.
Right.
So you had the king saying that you can import this and nobody else can.
Right.
And stuff like that.
Yeah.
And the reason why the king would do that is that then he has a friend there who can pay him.
Yeah,
So
exactly. It's a source of tax revenue.
Yeah.
So this is the way that...
It's an extremely distortionary way of taxing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, actually, probably don't. I'd be very surprised if you knew this, and you might find it interesting. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, theologian, he was relatively wealthy, which is the reason why he had the time to write the stuff he did about getting married or not getting married and all the considerations he was having. And the reason for that is that his father challenged a royal privilege.
I did not know that.
He'd come over from Jutland, and he was selling some kind of cloth, and he wanted to move into, I think it was silk, and found that there was he couldn't do that, and he challenged that at the court, and the privilege was overturned. So I guess that's an example of bourgeois values kicking in, or whatever you call it, spreading and having a real consequence in society. Yeah, is that the sort of development you've seen all over the world?
Yes,
or rather all over the Western world, at least.
So we mentioned the financial sector a little bit ago, and the financial sector in the United States is the way it's regulated is just insane, and has been for a very long time. But for a really long time, there were restrictions on branch banking. So a bank couldn't have more than one location, and it couldn't do business across county lines. So if you're a bank in a little county in rural Iowa, you're not allowed to bank anywhere other than that particular county in rural Iowa. And if you think about what that does, it utterly messes up the risk profile, because it means that your entire loan portfolio is corn.
Yeah, if the harvest goes bad in Iowa, the bank is going to go bad.
Exactly, yeah. If the harvest goes bad, you're screwed. And so is everybody else. So Harry Brock, for whom the Brock School of Business at Stanford University is named, challenged Alabama banking regulations, which were very similar. And ultimately, I think at one point he was sued. I want to say he was sued by every bank in the state of Alabama at once, because he was trying to fight against these banking rules and banking regulations. And ultimately he won. And now Birmingham is actually a bit of a financial hub. Mm-hmm. And the banking system in the U.S. works a lot more efficiently than it did back when, again, if you're in Alabama in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, and you operate in a cotton county, then your entire loan portfolio again is cotton. So risk is completely.
I believe that's part of the reason why there were so many bank runs in the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So that was regulation creating that situation that the banks. Many banks actually went down, didn't they?
Right. Yeah, I think I want to say either 3,000 or 4,000 banks failed in the United States during the Great Depression, and 0 banks failed in Canada during the Great Depression, because the way that the Canadian banking sector was regulated, it allowed banks to spread their risk more broadly than banks in the United States were allowed to. So it
was regulation that caused the bank failures, and of course. People hearing about it say, "There you go, markets don't work."
Right.
So makes me think of this cartoon with the two little kids, and one of them has a blue crayon, one has a red, and there's been painting with red all over the world and all over the wall, and the parents turn up, and the red was, "He did it."
Right. Yeah. And that's frustrating sometimes. The history of the Great Depression, for example, is a history of bad monetary policy and bad regulation. But most people think. When most people think of the Great Depression, they think of this as this signal failure of unstable capitalism. Well, once again...
Can you give another couple of examples of that?
Sure. Of just regulation creating...
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's so many. Well, retail is a big one. You mentioned I've done some studies of Walmart in the United States, and a lot of major cities in the U.S. have rules that specifically prohibit companies like Walmart from entering. And of course, that keeps prices high. So one of the reasons why prices are so much higher for...
Is that legal to specifically say that Walmart is not allowed?
You're not. I don't believe you're allowed to say, "Thou shalt not have Walmart." But I think in a lot of cases what they'll do is they'll create a rule saying stores of this particular size, bigger than whatever, and it just so happens that the only store that refers to, the only store that fits that description is Walmart. This is one of the reasons why prices are so high and selection is so low in low-income areas in the United States. So, for example, I not long ago did a bit of comparison shopping for my Principles of Macroeconomics class. I went to a little store next to a housing project not too far from where I live, and bought a can of spinach, and it was $2 or $3. And the same quote unquote can of spinach would have been $1.50 or $1.75 at a nearby Walmart. And Birmingham is a little bit better than a lot of other cities in terms of allowing retail innovation and allowing larger retailers. But Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, et cetera, have very, very specifically tried to keep stores like Walmart and Target out, again, to the detriment of the people that they presumably care so much about.
Okay, so but a lot of people would say, no, that's not what's happening.
Right.
What happens is Walmart moves in, all the small shops are completed out of existence.
Right.
You end up with a situation where you have this big store far out, and only if you have a car will you be able to get there. And then you have a food desert or whatever it's called in your local area where you can't get any food really. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so first I would appeal directly to the evidence. So in 2019,
that's always clever.
Yeah, well, it just so happens
everything else fails. Look at the evidence,
and it just so happens I've got a paper about exactly this question. So,
okay.
So in 2019, my co-authors and I published a paper in a journal called Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy that looked at the relationship between Walmart supercenters and food security. So in the U.S., the government measures food security with a survey and asks questions like, how often did you, in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, have you skipped meals because you didn't have enough money for food? And we find that when Walmart supercenters enter, food security improves. So people have, by virtue of the fact they have access to better selection and lower prices, the frequency with which they're skipping meals because they can't afford food actually goes down. There is a real concern there, though, that if you have, if you're running a store competing directly with Walmart, then your days are numbered if Walmart opens next door. But that said, the process of what the economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction is one where we replace old ways of doing things with new ways of doing things.
Right.
And people will they'll choose to shop at Walmart, they'll choose to shop at Target because they prefer the lower prices and the better selection, or they'll get lower prices at the stores they already shop at because of Walmart and Target's competitive pressure. Then the money they're able to save, they can do more with. Yeah. So there's a really interesting study. It's about 2008 or so. And one of the examples it used was in Morgantown, West Virginia. And yeah, sure, Walmart opens and a lot of the Walmart competitors go out of business, but eventually they're replaced by new stuff. They're replaced by boutique clothing outlets. They're replaced by fancy ice cream shops, places that don't sell the stuff that Walmart does. And I remember when I was in graduate school, I don't know if this has been, if anybody's really followed up on this, and graduate school was a long time ago now. But I remember reading about Aldi's expansion patterns. So we have Aldi in the United States as well. And we actually shop there pretty frequently. But in about 2003, 2004 or so, I remember reading an article about Aldi's strategy being to open stores where Walmart has come in and other places have closed. So they're basically opening a bunch of new stores in Walmart's shadow. And of course, shopping at Aldi is a very different experience from shopping at Walmart.
And they tend to open close to each other, right?
Yeah, that was the story as of about almost 20 years ago. But
that's what I've been observing here in Denmark as well. You always tend to have a high end and a low end shop right next to each other, so that people can go and buy their toilet paper and maybe their beer in the low end one, and then they go into the high end one and get what they need from there, fish or fresh fish or whatever.
Well, we think about thinking about Walmart. Think about Walmart in competition. The idea that Walmart's going to drive everybody out of business and then they're going to be the only show in town, that just doesn't happen. And even then, the effect of Walmart, or Walmart's effect on competition, on selection and price, means that people have greater scope to do other things. So where we do see a lot of innovation then is in areas and sectors that provide things Walmart doesn't do. So again, you go to Walmart, and Walmart is unbelievable. Like it's incredible, the selection and everything. But they specialize in providing low to medium quality goods for people of relatively modest means. So a lot of places that are able to provide stuff Walmart doesn't do are in fact able to do better as a result of Walmart's effect on prices and selection and making everybody around them kind of richer.
I guess some of the stuff you're seeing in some city centers is that they used to have all kinds of shops with all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And most of those are gone now, and people shop for those things in different places. But then you get cafes, and you get ice cream shops, and you get specialty shops of certain kinds, luxury goods that are sold, and it actually makes the high street nicer.
Yeah,
when people go there to have a good time and maybe sit down and have a cup of coffee outside in the street when the weather's like this, stuff like that. Yeah. Whereas in the old days, you went there to do your shopping and then you left.
Yeah. I don't remember,
but not all towns are moving in that direction. Some are actually having trouble, getting shops in them at all.
Yeah, and it's important not to pretend that doesn't exist. Obviously, I can't imagine anything worse than like you poured your life into a business and now it's gone because Walmart opened up down the road. it's important to keep in mind that is like those are real costs. Those are real human beings paying real prices, and in a decent society.
What is the bourgeois answer to that?
Okay, in a decent society, like you take care of your friends and neighbors.
Right.
You do stuff like if your neighbor loses a job, you invite them over for dinner, or you get together and you make sure they have what they need. I know that. It's pretty common practice, I guess, in most places. When someone has a baby, all of their friends and family, they bring them food and they take care of them. And for a little bit, similar sort of story again, when someone loses a job or loses a business, there are institutions of civil society that are pretty good at easing that transition. There is no way around the fact, though, that if you have run a shop your entire life and it goes into business, that's a real damage, or that's real damage to a real person. But there are real benefits being created for other real people who now have greater scope to live the lives that they want to live.
I guess there's also opportunity created by that. As we were talking about before, that person can transition into another kind of shop, or getting employed or whatever.
Yeah,
if you have a flexible labor market and free market economy and all that.
And the reason people hate economists is we don't know exactly what people are going to do. Again, if you'd asked me. I think about when I was in college in the late 1990s, nobody said being a social media manager or having a social media presence or podcasting would be the sorts of areas where you're going to have opportunities to grow and opportunities to earn money. We fundamentally don't know what people are going to come up with. For a lot of folks, that's very scary, but I find it almost a reason for hope. To say, or a reason to be really excited, is to know that, okay, sure, we're going to have some of these short run changes, but it's all going to be replaced ultimately with something even better. So again, just to use a specific example, you mentioned ice cream shops. We spend more money on premium ice cream now than I'm really frankly comfortable with, but because I'm a giant cheapskate. But one of the reasons we're able to do that is because we can buy stuff on Amazon, for example, and we spend a lot less time and a lot less money shopping.
Ice cream on Amazon.
Ice cream. Well, no, excuse me, no. Sorry, we
buy. You buy other stuff.
No. Well, it's actually funny because they're offering same day delivery now in some places. But yeah, so for example, I was on my way home from getting a haircut, and my haircut stylist, I suppose, said, you need to buy this little particular thing to trim your hair. And so a couple of flicks of my thumb, it was on its way from Amazon. And so the time I didn't spend shopping for a little razor, the money I didn't spend because it was cheaper as a result of Amazon, that meant we were able to go to the ice cream shop a little bit more often.
Yeah.
And so we spend more money at the premium ice cream shop than we would have been able to were it not for say the effect of Amazon, the effect of Walmart on some of these other sectors.
I guess a few years ago, I would have, if you said to me, how did the West become rich? I would have said, well, we started to protect property rights. I've been talking about institutions.
Yep.
And the rule of law, but you and Deirdre have sort of pushed a little bit to that storyline and said, well, but why? Is this correct? What you're really saying is, yeah, that's all very fine, but why?
Yeah,
why did property rights suddenly become so important? Why did we start thinking that way? Why did we start thinking that we need to protect property rights? Yeah. And that's what you're about.
Right. So when we think about institutions, and I in my heart of hearts, institutions matter. But things like property rights and the rule of law, we argue, are necessary but not sufficient for the great enrichment that we saw over the last 3 or so centuries. So you have to have private property rights, and you have to have the rule of law in the same way that you have to have oxygen to have fire. But just because you have oxygen doesn't mean you're going to have fire. Just because you have property rights and the rule of law doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to get long-run economic growth. And indeed, we've had relatively secure property rights in the West for many centuries, and we've had a relatively well-functioning rule of law for a very, very long time. And again, we have to have these. Like we can't not have property rights and not have a rule of law and still have economic growth. But we need something else to really light the fire and set things going. And for in the argument that we're making, it's economic liberty and social dignity for entrepreneurs and innovators, saying, okay, yeah, sure, you can try new things without having to ask anybody's permission. There's a fantastic book by a scholar.
Couldn't that be deduced directly from property rights? I own this property, I own these tools, I can do with them whatever I want, and whatever I produce out of it is mine, and I can sell it to, freedom of transaction and all that. Is that all deducible directly from the axioms of economic freedom?
Maybe. Well, so you can have secure property rights, but you can also have pathological property rights in a sense too. And here we might be using the phrase a little bit differently. So, for example, the way that the guilds worked in the medieval period is you had a property right to a particular market. Yeah. Like you in the guild, you had a property right to the
like taxi medallions.
Right. Yeah. Taxi medallions. Exactly. Yeah. So that is very much a property right. It was a secure property right. Yeah. And the development of ride sharing, like,
and in many ways, the person who has bought that taxi medallion should be compensated if we suddenly change the rules.
Right. Yeah. Well, some people would argue no. I would say as a matter of cosmic justice, I don't think so. Like, I don't think you deserve to be compensated because the rules changed. Especially if you have a property right you shouldn't have to begin with. As a matter of practical politics, I think it's pretty clear. Yeah, you do need to compensate people if the rules change.
Interesting, right?
But that's a fairly fine distinction. Yeah. I think. I would like, instead of prohibiting ride sharing, I think it would be much better for the government to just buy all the taxi medallions. Okay, now everybody can compete. I'm going to buy your taxi medallion from you, so you're now made whole. Everything's wonderful.
And you could have a similar idea for farm subsidies, right? Yeah. Protection of certain industries that have been going on for decades, and everybody has invested according to that.
Right.
You could argue. I would tend to argue. You disagree that you have an expectation that these are the rules, and you have no reason to think that they're going to be changed. And what are you going to do? You might even dislike the rules, but think, well, but these are the rules, so I'll invest according to those. And suddenly you change the rules,
right?
And your investment might go from $10 million to zero,
right?
Is that fair? I would argue compensation would be fair. So that's a bad word. It would be.
Well, yeah. So that's I try to tell my students, like, there are 3 4-letter F words you are not allowed to use in my classes. Right. Okay. Feel, free, and fair.
Okay.
But yeah. So when I think about it, it's sort of as a matter of abstract philosophy, or like what does justice require? Right. Like, I don't think that justice requires compensation. So I use subsidies for higher education in the United States, for example, which I love subsidies for higher education because they all go directly into my pocket. If we were to get rid of those subsidies, that would substantially reduce my standard of living, presumably. It's not clear to me that I'm really owed anything. Again, as a matter of abstract justice. I've been doing a lot of work recently on the South African.
Your sunk cost is mainly human capital, which you can transition into something else.
Yeah.
What if you'd also built your own office at the university and all that, and that suddenly goes to zero? Would you feel the same way?
I would like to think that as a matter of cosmic justice, I'm not owed anything. If the benefits I'm getting are basically my right to pick somebody else's pocket, which is basically what subsidies are. I've been doing a lot of work recently, though, on the South African economist W.H. Hutt, who spent a lot of time and energy talking about transition away from racist institutions in South Africa. And in the 1940s, he wrote this really interesting book called Plan for Reconstruction, where he laid out his idea for liberalizing Britain after World War II. And something he kept emphasizing and emphasizing and emphasizing is exactly the point you're making, is you have to honor established expectations. You have to honor established expectations, in part because you're going to need to get people to go along with the transition.
Right.
So yeah. So as a matter of cosmic abstract justice, maybe I'm not owed anything if we get rid of education subsidies. But if you tell the entire professoriate around the world, we're going to quit subsidizing higher education, and too bad, then you're going to have to expect some resistance. Right. So for Hutt, as a matter of practical politics, and I'm willing to go along with this as well.
Okay.
And he said in many cases we might have to actually swallow hard and accept some very serious injustice. But in the very long run, the additional economic growth we get more than pays for it. So just to use the example of racist institutions, which is something he spent his entire career criticizing. So apartheid in South Africa, one of the rules that they had was that blacks were specifically prohibited from having certain jobs.
Yeah.
And like no human being on earth, I would like to think, says that that's okay. And I doubt anybody would really say that somebody who's white and works in mining, and they owe their high income to the fact that blacks are literally not allowed to compete with them, would say that someone who is hurt by the abolition of racist institutions really has a big claim. What Hutt says, okay, yeah, sure, we might find it morally noxious to think that we have to buy off people who are currently benefiting from racism, but it's a small price to pay, or at least it's a worthwhile price to pay to make this transition more quickly and to make it without the possibility of violence.
And now we're back to the example of the local shop,
right,
that charges very high prices because Walmarts have not been allowed.
Right.
And that's their taxi medallion.
Yes.
And to what extent are they righteous? And to what extent is it not fair, but just that they should keep that privilege at the expense of everybody living in that area?
What I would love to see, in my perfect world, the way that we would handle this would be to say, because I'm virtually certain, I know that Danish land use regulations are a big part of what keeps really big stores like Walmart out of the country. I am almost certain that if you go to Netto or you go to Aldi or you go to any store and ask, what are the regulations that you hate? Or how much do you love paying taxes? You're probably going to get a long list of things that people wish would go away. I would love to see the compensation come in the form of reductions in other regulations and reductions in tax burdens and things like that. So rather than say making a cash payment to somebody, an incumbent that would be hurt by the entry of Walmart or somebody else, say we're going to get rid of this huge stack of regulations and rules and things like that that are prohibiting you from doing business the way you know you can do business. And I think that would be an improvement for everybody. But as a matter of practical politics, that's
interesting. It is one theory about how to achieve sort of free market change is to bundle a lot of it together into one big package. So there's something for everyone that is a little harmful. You know, basically. Flipping the logic of concentrated concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Flipping that logic around so that there's a huge package where you get a lot of small benefits everywhere, and together they add up to something that's actually worth the cost that is being put on you there. And if anything's taken out, you'll go, wait. If you take that out, I need this one to be taken out as well. So you need to keep it all in for it to happen.
Yeah.
Are there any examples that you know of big reforms that have? I think Australia did something similar to that.
Yeah, I don't remember the details.
Interesting discussion. Now, regulation is there's bad and there's good regulation. The way I think about it, you know, and we've. Property rights is a kind of regulation. You enforce, you protect, and you enforce property rights and contracts and things. What are the good regulations in your opinion?
That's pretty much
society?
it. I would say having a legal system that protects property rights and that provides people with secure continuity of expectations is pretty much it. There's really not a whole lot that a regulatory state can do that
consumer
markets. Consumer protection, similar story. So for example, one of the so when I travel, a lot of times I'll buy something for my kids, right? And I remember years ago, and in fact I bought one of these from my trip here. You can get these little, they're like Legos, little airplanes, but they're made by a different company, and they're terrible. I mean, they're so bad. I remember putting one of these together and just being so disappointed. And this is a perfect example, or this is a good example, because when you buy Lego and like real Lego, they have so much invested in their brand name and so much invested in knowing the kind of quality that you're going to get. This is a really, really powerful, powerful mechanism that protects consumers. That if you're buying something that says Lego on it, then you can expect a pretty high quality product. And if you don't get the high quality product, then they're going to take care of you. If you buy something from I don't want to get sued, so knockoff Lego, and it's terrible, then
private label Lego,
right, then you paid a lot less, but you also you knew what you were getting for the most part.
So what's the point? The branding does the job?
Yeah, brand names do the work. Brand names do the work. So for example, I ate dinner at McDonald's last night, which is probably not a good idea in its own right. But I know
you'll get a better dinner tonight.
That's the hope. That's the hope. I knew when I went in, I didn't go in and ask for, give me all your health regulation paperwork and things like that, because I don't read Danish anyway. I knew just by virtue of seeing the sign, I knew more or less what I was going to get. I knew it was going to taste pretty good, and it was going to be reasonably cheap.
But if I start up a shop,
sure,
and I think I just want to make some quick money, and I can actually make quite a lot by cheating a lot of people. And, if I'm just cheating people of a few dollars or Danish kroner or whatever, it's not a big deal.
Right.
But if it's harmful to their health, or if they're buying something that's actually more expensive, and I could even pretend to be Lego.
Right.
I guess you have regulation there that's warranted. But even if I don't, if I'm saying, well, I have the shop and I'm selling this to you, and you get sick from wouldn't most people would say, I want some kind of protection to make sure that this doesn't happen.
Yeah. So here I appeal to Thomas Sowell, who famously says repeatedly that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs.
Right.
And in an imperfect world full of imperfect people, you're going to have at least some horrible stuff. I guess the question is what sets of institutions minimize all of this? An interesting question I don't really know the answer to is the market for actually fake Lego. So before I left, I sat down with my 10-year-old, and he talked about how he has a bunch of fake Lego, and I said, how do you know?
Wow.
And he said, well, if you look at if you look at these particular parts of the pieces, it's got Lego written on it really, 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 really tiny. And so he gave me this little master class in how to identify real and fake Lego. And I don't know necessarily why there is apparently such a big, thick market for fake Lego. And you can go on Amazon, for example, you can buy, if you're not careful about it, you can buy a bunch of Space Wars minifigures, which look exactly like Star Wars, but they're. Do
you think Lego should be able to go after those and say, look, guys, you're infringing on our copyright patents or whatever? Yeah,
that's a good question. And there's a lot of. There's a lot of debate about the role of intellectual property. There, I don't really know. I'm skeptical of. Well, there's something to be said for going after somebody for copyright infringement when it seems very, very clear that what they're selling is they're trying to pass off as the real thing. Like that strikes me as fraudulent. I don't know necessarily why Amazon doesn't crack down on this, which for the most part, Amazon does. They're Amazon, eBay, Walmart, et cetera. They tend to be very, very good about policing their own sites and policing their own areas. That's just one example of what I think is a seemingly a conspicuous failure. But I'm not sure that creating a government level Bureau of Lego authenticity would solve more problems than it creates. And I'd be very interested. I'd be very interested too. This is just something I haven't taken the time to look into. So how does Lego handle this? How do they deal with the existence of
but I'm not talking specifically about Lego. I'm talking about that kind of regulation, because you're saying that's more or less it. But that gives the listener and viewers an idea of you're a very free market guy. Right? And I would argue that moving towards more regulation from that position, in the beginning, there is an argument for a lot of the stuff, but there's also an argument against. And then as you move on and on and on, it becomes clearer and clearer that this is mostly harmful.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
I do. And I think when you think about consumer product safety regulation, there's imagining how this would work in a perfect world. And then there's how it actually works in the real world we inhabit, and the two things are very, very
Nirvana
different.
fallacy. You say, let's imagine that we can regulate the world in a perfect way. Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice? Well, that would. I guess you could argue that it'd be nice, but it's not. That's not what happens. You get imperfect regulation.
And then importantly, fly-by-night operations tend not to really be able to charge high prices, and they're probably not going to be as profitable over the long run as established firms or as places that establish good brand names. So, for example, you think about staying in a hotel that's not, so this is, the development of chain stores, for example, in the United States happened in part because a guy named Kemmons Wilson realized that when you're driving across the country and you pull into a hotel or a restaurant and you have out-of-state license plates, that's just a giant sign saying, "Rip me off."
Right.
He realized that if you create a chain of hotels, and he created Holiday Inn, such that you see the sign and you know more or less what you're going to get, that's a transaction cost reducer. It's important to remember as a consumer, a deal that looks too good to be true almost certainly is too good to be true. And it's true that you're taking a risk, but in a big sense, you're being compensated for that risk in the form of a lower price. So I think that brand names are much better regulators than officials in Copenhagen or Washington, D.C. And
but you could argue that people are risk averse and they don't want to risk it. And it's nicer to have the government. And then whenever you go to a hotel, you know for sure that blah blah blah.
Well, it's nice to think that they're taking care of you.
There are costs to that. And as you move along the sort of the spectrum of regulation towards more and more nanny state type regulation, it gets more and more serious. Why is how can regulation harm innovation, productivity, and growth?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. A lot of times just because I've written an article called "The Extent of the Market is Limited by the Imagination of the Regulator." So Adam Smith writes, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. The extent of the market is limited by the imagination of the regulator, because there's so much stuff in the world and so many innovations that happen that are not what we normally would have just thought about. No, I wasn't thinking when I was sitting in college in 1998, I really wish I had an iPhone. None of us were thinking that. Steve Jobs and the folks at Apple said, I bet we could do this and it would work really, 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 really well. We didn't have a Facebook.
I don't think Steve Jobs, when he invented it, knew what it was going to be used for.
No, not at all. In fact, when they rolled out the iPad in 2010, I remember a lot of journalists saying, "Well, what is this for?" And Steve Jobs, I don't think Steve Jobs knew. It was just, here's something that we think that we think has some serious possibilities. It's easy to think.
I remember when the Internet of Things just came out. There were these futurists and others who were saying, okay, what is this going to be used for? And there's this guy in Denmark who said, well, imagine that you have your scale and you step on it and it turns out you put on some weight and the scale sends a signal to your fridge that you shouldn't buy any ice cream or butter or anything. I just thought, who'd want that? Who on earth would want your scale to decide?
I would.
Are you sure?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I probably. Yeah. A lot of Americans, I would think. It's
no, but it's an example of what can you think of, and as it turns out now, it's becoming all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
But when this thing starts, you have a vague idea of what it could be used to, and you give some examples, and they're not very good, and then it revolutionizes something completely different. It's always like that with invention, isn't it?
Well, and I hate to bring up this specific example because it sounds like I'm just sort of complaining, but a few years ago, my wife tried to start a business making fermented foods in Birmingham, and so she made kimchi, which is a Korean fermented cabbage, and so she went to the health department because she needed the permission from the health department so she could get a business license so that she could produce this stuff in Birmingham. And so she went to the health department and said, "Okay, what is kimchi?" So this is the brilliant irony of it all is presumably we have the regulators there to protect consumers from unscrupulous business people, but the regulators themselves didn't know what the product was. And then my wife ended up giving up because it just became too much of a nightmare to try to deal with local regulators and regulation. Right. They can stand in the way. They can stand in the way of innovation because first they're going to tend to have limited imagination, not because they're stupid people or anything like that, but just because everybody's got limited imagination. And second, they're going to tend to have really bad incentives. So the incentive for a regulator is to be way too cautious. There are a couple of mistakes that a regulator can make when they're thinking about something like food or drugs or what have you, and that is to approve a drug that is unsafe, or to prohibit a drug that is safe, or to approve a food that's unsafe, or prohibit a food that's safe. This is a major problem with the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, and one of the reasons why drugs are so expensive in the U.S. is because all of the incentives for FDA regulators are to prevent the approval of safe drugs. Because if you let a bad drug through, then you've got a body, or you've got people who are dead, maybe you've got people crying on TV, et cetera, and you've got newspapers saying, okay, who's to blame? Who let this bad drug get through? So then you get blamed and you suffer some very, very serious professional consequences. If you fail to approve a good drug, the consequences may be just as bad, but they're a lot harder to see.
100 times worse.
Yeah, or 100 times worse. Yeah. But they're a lot harder to see. 100 people
die that could have gotten that drug. Yeah, but that's the unseen, isn't it?
Yeah,
Bastiat.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So, so regulators tend to be way too cautious because they don't have any skin in the game.
Right.
And I think we see the relationship between the FDA and drug development is a great example in the United States. One of the major problems. So I've been saying that when I get back to the U.S., I'll talk about having visited this free market paradise that is Denmark. And part of it is apparently in many European countries, it's a lot easier to get drugs developed and drugs approved than it is in the U.S. It's a lot easier. Well, it's funny. I looked at data on retail regulation because it's part of what I'm here to talk about. And retail regulation in the United States is stricter than retail regulation in Denmark, the land use planning rules notwithstanding. But yeah, regulators tend to be way too cautious. Yeah. And they tend to think in terms of scary scenarios. So another example is ride sharing. So Uber and Lyft in the United States. When that was being debated in Birmingham, there were, of course, all these questions about about whether or not it was safe, and everyone in city council talking about safety. And somebody said, "Well, you have no idea who you're getting in a car with." And what I tell my students is, if you're a serial killer, I can think of no worse way to be a serial killer than to try to drive for Uber or Lyft, because everything's being tracked in real time with GPS. if I'm a rider, I've got a picture of the person who's supposed to be picking me up, a picture of the car, the license plate of the car, the enormous amount of information. It would be a very, very easy crime to solve.
Locked up within 10 minutes.
Right. Yeah. If I were to disappear, then the amount of information they have to go on is simply staggering. So it's funny that Uber and Lyft in the U.S. are, I think, way more trustworthy than the officially regulated taxi cabs.
Yeah, and you have all these amazing examples of people sending their children, somewhere to an aunt to stay the night or whatever, in an Uber or Lyft, or I think it was Russ Roberts who had this example in his Econ Talk podcast of this guy who had on him, he went from Washington to New York, and the driver said, "Why aren't you taking the train?" He said, "Well, because I have these very, very expensive jewels." I think it was on him.
Oh wow!
And I just don't dare. But and the driver says, "Well, you aren't afraid that I might steal it?" No, because I know who you are.
Right? Yeah, exactly. because if you steal these, you'll get a 1-star rating, and you're not gonna. That's gonna hurt your earning potential.
No, but not only that. I mean, you could probably live off that forever, but he'd get caught.
Right.
I mean, he has tracked who he's with.
Yes.
And that's the safest place for him to be with all that value on him is in an Uber or Lyft car. Now that's amazing.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot of regulation that that you can improve, right? Yeah. I mean, they're sort of your first best might be no regulation,
right?
And other sort of more less liberal or less libertarian, more classical liberal, or moving down towards social liberal people might say, well, I want some regulation, but I want it to be in a way that doesn't harm innovation. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Different ways of handling regulation so that it doesn't harm innovation in markets as much.
Yeah. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to be picked. One of the things for example, the OECD is producing guidelines of best practices for regulation. And one of the things that OECD says is that regulation should have sunset provisions so that after a certain number of years, a regulation automatically expires and it has to be renewed. And I think that would be a fantastic way to improve the quality of regulation in the United States and elsewhere. Just to say,
is that actually an OECD recommendation, sunset clauses?
It is, unless I read the document incorrectly.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So they had a piece recently on.
I'd love to see that.
Okay.
Maybe we can link to it in show notes.
They have
that's interesting.
They have a fantastic report on indicators of product market regulation, and in fact they refer to France having more sunset rules for regulations, and as being an example of a serious improvement. I become more and more enthusiastic about piecemeal reform rather than sort of like wholesale revolution. Sort of the older I get, and the more I understand that not everybody.
Have you ever been in favor of revolution? Right? Really?
Well, I mean, not violent revolution, but just thinking like if I could push a button and get rid of the state, then probably. But
okay.
I think sunset provisions would be a really, really, really good way to do it. Shall issue rules. So, for example, again, thinking about my wife's experience with the health department, I would love for regulation to be. I would love for the rule to be not that somebody has to prove to the regulator that what they're doing is safe, but that they're allowed to do it no matter what, and the burden of proof is on the regulator to show that they should be stopped.
So she needs to inform the regulator that I'm now doing this,
right.
And then they can look at it. Yeah. And they can come back and have to prove why this is
right.
I guess another approach would be to say that we consider food regulation in a number of countries that are similar to ours. Kimchi is that's South Korea, isn't it?
Right.
That's a wealthy country. They probably have decent food regulation. If it's legal there, it's automatically also legal here. So stuff like that.
Right. Yeah, and that's another fantastic example. I know a lot of people in the United States and various other places have proposed that if it's been approved somewhere, then it should be you should be allowed to do it in the U.S.
Right.
So, for example, a lot of drugs, for example, that are approved in Europe that are not approved in the U.S., or pasteurized versus unpasteurized cheese is a big thing. We don't have the same culinary selection in the U.S. that a lot of European countries have because of the way that cheese is regulated. Saying, I would think about
for historic reasons. I'm pretty sure all these French cheeses would not be allowed in France if it wasn't for the fact that they had been allowed when regulation started.
That's probably a good point.
If somebody invented Camembert now, they go, oh, geez, they're all full of, and the whole process is.
Yeah. That's a good point. I would like to see too. What was I thinking? French cheese regulation. So specifically with respect to medicine and the practice of medicine. So this is, again, another area in the United States, especially where there's a lot of restrictions on entry. So the American Medical Association has made it so that there are far fewer doctors than there would otherwise be. And someone who is trained in a medical school that's not AMA approved in, say, Denmark or Sri Lanka or somewhere else cannot practice medicine in the United States. And that's crazy. I remember reading an article about a doctor trained in Sri Lanka or somewhere, who delivers pizzas in the U.S. And this is an incredible waste of resources. I think if you have a medical license in one place, you should be allowed to practice somewhere else.
And that's very specific to the healthcare sector in the U.S., isn't it? I had a conversation with Michael Cannon from the Cato Institute about U.S. healthcare recently, and we can link to that. And we spoke specifically about that in Denmark, I mean, nurses from Norway and Sweden and all over the European Union really can come to Denmark. Obviously, for some countries, there's a language issue, but a nurse can come and practice here in Denmark. Doctors can come and practice here. We have an internal market for that. But you don't even internally in the US have an internal market. A nurse from one state can't go and become a nurse in another state, not directly anyway.
Right. So there are...
So that's very specific for the healthcare sector, as you're the country of immigration, but immigration of doctors are not welcome. As long as they work as pizza delivery men instead.
Well, and even then, maybe not. It's also true of education and a lot of other things. So whenever we have, so there are a lot of natural disasters in the U.S. So in the southern United States, we get a lot of hurricanes, and there's always controversy. So whenever a hurricane hits Florida or Louisiana or something like that, about whether or not carpenters and people in the skilled trades from like Massachusetts should be allowed to come and ply their trade in Louisiana or Florida where they don't have licenses.
Oh, so it's not just the medical profession.
Not just the medical profession.
Okay. So is it almost all professions, or is it a few?
Pretty much all professions. I think if you...
Wow.
Yeah, I think you have to be... So I went to graduate school in St. Louis, which is right on the border of Missouri and Illinois. And a lot of lawyers they would take both the Missouri bar exam and the Illinois bar exam. So they'd be members of the Missouri bar and the Illinois bar. I don't think they would be allowed to practice in Tennessee or Alabama or somewhere else if they're not members of those particular state bars.
But I guess state laws can be different.
Right.
So there's some reason for that. But carpentry is...
Similar thing. Yeah. If you don't have... there are a lot of places that have location-specific licensing. So, for example, if you have a carpentry license, say, or a flower arranging license in Louisiana, then that may not travel across state lines. It might not be too hard to get a new license.
Because wood in Michigan is
right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. Wood. Right. Yeah. It's and they're always going to be at least semi-plausible arguments for it. So think about cosmetology, for example. We pay way too much for haircuts, and I don't think cosmetology licenses, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think cosmetology licenses travel very well across state lines. And a lot of times people might say, oh, well, you're working with chemicals and you're working with sharp objects and whatnot, but again, cutting hair is cutting hair. One of my favorite examples of this was, years ago, I went to get a haircut and I hadn't shaved. And I remember watching old episodes of the Andy Griffith Show and like Floyd the Barber shaving people. And so I asked the person behind the chair what would it cost for a shave? And he said, oh, I can't do that. So I have a cosmetology license. I don't have a barbering license. So since he didn't have a barbering license, he couldn't shave customers. And it's weird because like he could run a straight razor along the back of my neck, but he would not have been allowed to run that same straight razor across the front of my face. And this is 100% to restrict entry, keep prices high. And again, like I said, I'd love to see more interjurisdictional competition. Not competition. Call it regulatory cooperation, where if someone has a license to cut hair in Denmark, then they can go anywhere they want in the United States and do the same thing.
Yeah. Or start out even in the US.
Right.
I mean, and that would help a lot of people and have the same kind of effect as your Walmart example. It would drive down prices. It would that would increase real wages because real wages are a product of what you actually earn and what you can buy from it.
Right.
And people would have more disposable income for other endeavors than getting a haircut or whatever it is. And that would help people into employment and create wealth. And those kinds of processes.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I think about when I think about what would I do more of if my money went further. And one of the things I would do more frequently is probably get more haircuts.
Yeah.
And that's a small thing, but if you take 330 million people in the United States and everybody gets a few more haircuts every year, that's a lot of additional work for people cutting hair.
Yeah.
So what might look at a very, very small, or in the context of say like one individual, what may not look like much is added up across a much, much larger population can end up being something fairly substantial.
Yeah, and all these things we've been talking about now are small examples. I mean, if you take the total code that regulates business in the US or in Denmark, at least, we're here at CPOS, we count the number of words in regulation, like they also do at, I think, the Makeda Center and other places in the US. And it's a similar picture. It grows by a couple of percentage points, maybe 3% some years every year. And that adds up to, over a lifetime, that is a 20-fold increase in the total amount of regulation if you assume that the number of words are directly are one-to-one with the amount of regulation. It probably is. They probably don't stick words.
Yeah, they're very highly. They've got to be very highly correlated.
It's not all poems in there,
right?
You know,
it's
you must or you can't or whatever. And business regulation, most of it will, to some extent, have this effect of, oh, I can't do this,
right?
And innovators will end up in a situation where like your wife, I would like to produce, I'd like to try this new thing, but I'm not, sometimes it's, okay, I know that it's not legal, and I have to persuade them first. In other cases, it will be, I don't know if this is legal.
Right, yeah.
The uncertainty of the regulation. What is it actually saying? How would you interpret this? How would a court or how would the authorities interpret this? And you need a lawyer to look at it. And sometimes the lawyers, I speak to lawyers who say, quite frankly, often I tell my clients I don't have a clue if what they are considering doing is legal. And then I tell them you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, I think about this when I think about possible entrepreneurial endeavors. I think, maybe I should start this or start that. I'll then think, okay, well, do I want to go to the headache of dealing with the regulation? Do I want to go to the headache of possibly doing something illegal and not finding out that it's illegal until until I'm halfway into starting the business? There's a lot of uncertainty. So we've talked about expectations, and when I look at building regulations and things like that, a lot of times you can get so in the U.S. or in Birmingham specifically, you can get a waiver on particular regulations at the discretion of the person in charge of this office or that office or the other office, and so that in a lot of ways undermines the rule of law because it makes it makes a lot of questions about what you can and can't do strictly at the discretion of whoever happens to be in office at the time.
Yes,
and that's
if it was a different, if you came if you came a year earlier or a year later, it might be someone else who might have ruled differently, on that, and that's not the rule of law. That's something completely different.
Absolutely.
So, do you think this whole? Let's wrap up with this.
Sure.
Do you see a risk that this development towards more and more regulation is threatening the bourgeois deal. Not just the deal itself, but the values, the bourgeois values that are behind the society we're living in.
I don't think it's a threat or a risk. I think it's something that's actually happening. There's pretty substantial evidence that regulation in the last 50 years or so has slowed down economic growth. So again, we think about the rise of the regulatory state in the United States and Europe in the 1970s. This was something that substantially reduced economic growth and overall prosperity. And the more we move in this direction of having to ask permission for everything we do, the more we treat responsible adults like they're children, and the more we create a culture of asking permission, more of a culture of saying if it's not explicitly permitted, it's prohibited, and more of a culture of frankly spying on one another and trying to find ways to rat out our neighbors for doing something wrong. Just another example.
Or our competitors.
Right, or our competitors, right. Just another example. I know in a lot of places in the U.S., when you ride a bike, you're required to wear a helmet. And on one of the local social media apps, people were complaining about our son. It's like, who's this kid who's riding around? His parents aren't around, and he's riding around without a helmet and blah, 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 blah. And so first of all, he's a couple of blocks from the house. Second, he can take care of himself. And third, it's just if it weren't for these helmet rules and regulations, and this is just an example, like what reason would other people in the neighborhood have to be, frankly, getting into our kids' business? I think we become a society of distrustful snitches. The more regulation, the more rules that we have. And I don't think that's something that is appropriate for a free people.
Okay. On the other hand, if it was just a concern, if you think, if your neighbor thinks a child should wear a helmet,
right? Yeah.
And shows concern and goes, wait a minute, who is this child? Should we alert the parents or whatever? Wouldn't that be a civil society thing? Yeah,
there's a certain amount of that, obviously. And in this particular case, they said, well, we think he lives in this house over here. And they were talking about our house. I said, well, okay, great. If you are concerned, come knock on the door, introduce yourself.
Instead of throwing it out on social media. Yeah, I agree. That's not the way to go about that.
Yeah. And we do want to take care of each other, obviously. And you're right, that is an example of civil society. But I think...
what if it was at night and your child had forgotten to put on the lights on his bike, and somebody rides by in a car and goes, hey, young man, remember the lights.
Right.
There's also an argument for him. Next time I might actually drive into you, and I don't want that. I don't want to experience and having that on my conscience.
Yeah. And that's very different though. That's
is it? I mean, he could also drive into the boy wearing a helmet, and he if he'd had the helmet on, he'd be fine.
Okay. So this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, not being able to see somebody at night, I think, is very different from them just not having the safety equipment that you think they should have during the day. And second, there's a lot of evidence that people in cars tend not to give as wide a berth to people wearing helmets and safety gear and things like that. So there's an example of what's called the Peltzman Effect.
Yeah.
So Sam Peltzman, speaking of regulatory economics, in the 1970s looked at seatbelt laws in the United States and found that, well, okay, when you mandate seatbelts, people drive more recklessly. We have a very similar phenomenon
and they actually
with things like helmets.
More bikers.
Yeah. Kill more people on bikes and pedestrians. Yeah. Similarly, in the U.S., if cars aren't giving as wide a berth to people on bikes with helmets, then that's probably going to create more accidents and things like that. In this particular case, I would be. I don't know that I would have minded somebody saying, young man, you should be wearing a helmet, or someone knocking on our door and saying, we're concerned about your kid, whatever, and being able to have the conversation, be like, okay, I understand your concern, I appreciate it. We trust him to ride his bike, whatever. As opposed to just sort of anonymously posting on the internet, here are these strangers over here who are doing this bad thing, or even worse, calling the cops.
And frankly, creating a risk that it could go viral or something
right.
like that.
Yeah.
So the social, I guess we're moving a little bit off topic here, but let's end on this. I guess what the social media is creating is sort of a fake village where, I mean, if you come and knock on the door, and say, look, I know it's none of my business, but what are your thoughts on your son? Do you know he's not wearing a helmet? You know, that's very different. That's an actual village. That's actual interaction between people.
Right.
Whereas this fake global village where you pretend to be concerned about people that you know nothing about. Or you pretend to know something about people, or you can have what you write can have consequences for people who you don't know and who you will never meet.
Right.
That's toxic.
Yes.
That's very different from actually going there and knocking on the door. You're gonna have some respect for that.
Right.
It takes a bit of guts to do that.
Yeah.
The other thing, that's just grandstanding.
Yeah, I think we're moving in a direction of getting law enforcement involved for everything.
Yeah.
And less in a direction of, again, knocking on the door and saying, "Hey, I think your son." I would much rather someone knock on the door and say, "Hey, your son is smoking behind the behind the grocery store or something like that," than have them calling the cops. Similarly, I'd much rather have someone knock on the door and saying, "Hey, I think your son should be wearing a helmet." We're moving more in the direction of getting the police involved, and less in the direction of taking care of each other the way that a real village does.
Is there evidence of that?
I think there is. I'd have to look, but I think there's more. I want to say I think there's more interaction between people and police than there's been traditionally. I could also just be remembering remembering very vivid anecdotes.
Okay.
So.
Let's see.
Definitely true in the regulatory state where you call the health department as opposed to
that's true. Yeah. That's true. Yes, and obviously sorting out problems on the basis of the particulars of the situation can create solutions that are plus some solutions, two winners. Whereas a regulation that comes from a distance from government will often create a situation where there's either one winner and one loser, or frankly, two losers. I'll finish with this. My grandfather was a regulator.
Oh, okay.
He was a chemist, and at one point he went to a factory that had gases in a tank. And one type of gas there and another type of gas there. And he measured, it needs to be 12 meters between these two tanks. And he measures up, he goes, okay, 10.5 meters. And the guy at the factory goes, so what do we need to do? Well, in theory, you need to tear down that wall and move that another couple of centimeters in that direction. But let me just measure up one more time. And he says, there you go.
12 meters, right? Yeah,
12 meters. Yeah. And there's. Is that corruption or is that against the rule of law? I think it's quite sensible. You have him judging, you're going, okay, the 12-meter thing. That is just, completely arbitrary.
Right. So this is a fascinating example because it's not really clear. Like it seems obvious to me that the right thing to do is exactly what your grandfather did. Yeah. As opposed to saying, I'm going to shut you down. You have to incur these enormous costs in order to meet the letter of the law. But that's another thing that regulation does is it creates all of these gray areas where it's not really clear whether you're doing something wrong or not. So another example again is at the local park where we walk our dog. They're the little baseball fields and the signs that say no dogs on the baseball field. And it's not really clear whether that actually means no dogs on the baseball field or if it's just there to absolve the city of liability in the case that someone puts their dog on the baseball field and something bad happens. I think this proliferation of rules creates a sort of uncertainty that I think you're exactly right, undermines the rule of law, makes it a lot harder to figure out exactly what the real rules actually are, and makes it easy sometimes, I think, to say, oh, that's not really a rule. That doesn't actually mean what the sign says, when maybe, in fact, it actually does.
That was great.
Thank you.
Art Carden, thank you very much for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, yeah.
And look forward to your the paperback version of your book with Deirdre McCloskey, Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, when that comes out. We'll buy it and put it under the Christmas tree.
Ah, fantastic.
Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.